Hello, my name is Andrew, and welcome to my kitchen. In this video, you're going to see me cook through 8 pounds of butter. This is part of an ongoing series on the channel where I cook through a large amount of one ingredient in an effort to better understand how that ingredient works. I'm usually cooking things I've never made before, often not getting it exactly right, but there's something about the repetition that is very fun and revealing. Butter is a magical ingredient. It's often said that the reason why restaurant food tends to taste a lot better or more exciting is that they're just using a lot more butter. And in this experience, I definitely push my personal upper limit of how much butter is too much butter. So I've already made all of these recipes, and now I'm gonna take you through how those experiences went. The first thing I made was compound butter, which is essentially just butter mixed with some seasoning ingredients that can be used in a variety of ways. But I wanted to start by trying to make my own butter. So I began by finding the best heavy cream available to me, and then I simply whipped it in a stand mixer the same way I would if I was making whipped cream. And if you've ever broken a whipped cream, then you are about 3/4 of the way to making your own butter. And I actually had to throw a towel over my mixer because it started splashing too much liquid. The moment that the butter really separates from the rest of the liquid is very sudden. Like it's just sloshing, 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 and then all of a sudden, there's a mound of butter in your whisk and liquid everywhere else. I strained my butter, squeezing out as much liquid as possible, rinsing it a couple of times with cold water, and then finally squeezing it with a cheesecloth to remove as much moisture as possible. And this was my butter. I knew conceptually how this worked, but I had never done it myself. It's pretty cool. So this was the butter I was gonna use for my compound butter, but I wanted to have some on its own, simply salted. This probably ranks as the best thing I ate throughout the whole video. That perfectly soft butter, lots of salt on good bread. It's very hard to beat. And I wanted to shout out that this bread comes from a place called Bub and Grandma's in Los Angeles. Often if you see me using bread in these videos, it usually comes from them. And I'd be remiss not to mention them because the quality of this combination is definitely in large part due to the quality of this bread. So now I have the rest of the butter that I'm gonna use for my compound butter, and I began by chopping some chives, parsley, grating some garlic, and adding salt, and some dry white wine, which is something I saw in Jacques Pepin's book, Essential Pepin. After that was well combined, I spread it on some parchment paper where I could then roll it into a log and chill it until it was firm. And that's the compound butter. This is now a thing that's available to me to add to pretty much anything where I would normally use butter. Compound butter is classically served as a finisher for steak. A simple pad on top adds that additional luxuriousness. The herbs and garlic are interacting and becoming aromatic from the heat of the meat. Amazing. I also took some to make simple scrambled eggs in the morning. One of my favorite things was actually broccoli that I simply blanched and then finish with this butter, because I think it represents the maximum return for the least amount of time. It wouldn't be that hard to cut up some herbs or add a little bit of garlic to something, but the fact that it's already done, it really turns it into something that you can complete in practically 4 minutes. Really, the limiting factor is just how long it might take your water to boil. The next thing I made was pound cake, which I immediately thought of with butter because pound cake is classically named for its ratio of a pound of butter to a pound of sugar to et cetera, et cetera. And I followed the recipe from James Beard, which was published in the New York Times. I began by sifting flour onto a sheet of wax paper, which I then used to transfer the flour back to the sifter to sift through a couple of times, incorporating baking powder and salt in the subsequent times. I thought the specificity of the wax paper was unnecessary, but it actually ended up being a very good tool to corral a bunch of flour with. I then separated my eggs. I then whipped the egg whites in a stand mixer, gradually adding sugar until it held soft peaks. I set the whites aside and used the same mixer to cream butter, adding a little bit of sugar there as well. The yolks I beat adding lemon zest and a little splash of rum. Beard's recipe calls for cognac, but I had rum on hand because I was using it for something else later. I then added the flour to the butter and egg mixture, and then added the egg whites to those, gently folding them in to not deflate the whites too much. When it was well mixed, I poured it into a prepared bundt tin and then baked it for about an hour. Pound cake is so good. I used to think it was called pound cake because you could just pound this cake, like devour it. I really liked the way that this particular mold accentuated the peaks around the ridge. It really created this sort of blade-shaped crust area, which I think is the best part of the pound cake. It is a fairly simple cake, which is why I think it's often glazed. I ended up eating some with some strawberry preserves I had, which was excellent. But I think this is one of the simplest representations of butter's role in baking and making a delicious cake. The next thing I made was Meunière. This is a dish that Julia Childs references as one of the first things she ate in France and contributed to her fascination with French cuisine. To make this dish, I began by clarifying some butter, taking some butter in a saucepan and heating it until it bubbled and the milk solids separated from the rest of the butter. This takes a little bit of time, but you need to be careful not to brown any of those solids, as that would alter its flavor, and then you would have browned butter. As the bubbles dissipate, that indicates that a lot of the water content has been evaporated out. Some of those milk solids will begin to sink, and then you can strain the butter, scooping off any last bits that remain, resulting in a very clear, clarified butter. And then there's my fish. I was able to get these beautiful fillets of petrale sole, which I simply seasoned and dredged in flour. In a heavy pan, I then added some of that clarified butter and briefly cooked the sole on either side, just until it was beginning to turn golden brown. But this being such a thin fillet, it was really gonna take no time to cook at all. I transferred my sole to a plate and held it in an oven at a very low temperature just to keep warm. In a small saucepan, I melted more butter. I referenced a few different recipes in making this dish, but the one by Ludo Lefebvre asks you to almost brown the butter. So in my saucepan, I melted that butter and took it until it was just at the browning point, and then added a squeeze of fresh lemon juice. On my plated sole, I sprinkled some fresh parsley and then poured that butter over the top of the fillets. I like that this dish featured both clarified butter and gently browned butter. The clarified butter, I think, is used because it will then not brown when cooking at a high temperature, keeping the flavor of that fish very pure. And then the brown butter, I think, is smartly added at the end because that level of toastiness can be controlled. Despite just swimming in butter, it's amazing how much balance that lemon juice can add to the whole dish. It wasn't overwhelming with butter. It really was quite delicious. The next thing I made were Sablé, French butter cookies. And I referenced a recipe from David Leibovitz, who was adapting one from the Little Flower Baking Cookbook by Christine Moore. These being butter cookies, I think it's important to use the best butter possible. I creamed that butter in a stand mixer with a bit of salt. In another bowl, I whisked together separated egg yolks with sugar, and then I added that to my stand mixer, which incorporated with the butter. I then sifted my flour and baking powder into that mixture, incorporating it, and then turning it out into a sheet of wax paper and packing it into a tight rectangle so that it could be chilled overnight in my case. The next day, I rolled out the dough, cut 2-inch circular rounds from it, and then chilled those in the freezer until firm. I then egg washed the cookies and created a crosshatch with a fork. They cook for just 15 minutes in a 350-degree oven, and I think on my first batch, I actually slightly underbaked them. I didn't think they had quite the texture that they were supposed to have. So on my second batch, I baked them a little bit longer, but they rapidly approach a burning point. This is definitely my preferred type of baked good. They're not too sweet, and they just carry this essence of butter in them. It's the same sort of perfume that you get from like biscuits. When you're making them, suddenly your whole house has the smell of butter. And I think that's reason enough to make them. The next thing I made was hot buttered rum, which I immediately thought of with butter because it is heavily featured in my favorite episode of the show, Frasier. And I referenced a recipe from Wine Enthusiast. For this recipe, I needed a stick of room temperature butter. So I employed this trick where you take some boiling water, fill a bowl, allow the bowl to become fully hot, pour out the water, and then flip it upside down on a stick of butter, and you just let it sit. And this is just a way of dramatically speeding up the time it would take to get a stick of butter to room temperature. So to that butter, I added a mixture of spices, including allspice, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg. I also added brown sugar, salt, and vanilla extract. You then essentially have a spiced compound butter, which I'm sure would be good for a lot of other applications. But for this drink, you only need a couple of tablespoons that you add some hot water to, as well as some dark rum. It sounds gross at first, like, oh, I'm just drinking melted butter. But it really is just a small amount in each individual glass. And if you think about the role that milk plays in coffee, what tastes better, skim milk or half and half? Well, butter is just the fat from cow's milk, so you're really just adding the essential component directly to the drink. Probably not a drink I'd like all the time, but on a sort of blizzardy day, I think it would be perfect. The last thing I made was Beurre Blanc, the classic French butter sauce. And I referenced a recipe from the YouTube channel French Cooking Academy. For Beurre Blanc, you begin with just a small amount of butter that you sweat a minced shallot in until it's just translucent. You then add white wine and white wine vinegar and reduce that liquid until it's almost completely evaporated. You then take a lot of butter, like basically 3 sticks of butter, and then with the heat off, you slowly whisk in a few cubes at a time, emulsifying it into this shallot mixture. And if you keep the temperature low and continuously whisk, you should be able to incorporate all of this butter and have this velvety, smooth texture at the end. I then strained my Beurre Blanc so that there wouldn't be these shallots in it, and then seasoned with salt and white pepper. I tried it in a couple of classic applications, like on some simple asparagus, or this roasted piece of salmon, which it was amazing on because it covered up the fact that I overcooked my salmon because I was so distracted by emulsifying the butter. I had sort of a roller coaster eating this Beurre Blanc. At first I was just so excited that I successfully made this sauce. And then I was suddenly disgusted, like, oh my God, this is a ridiculous amount of butter. What am I doing? The realization that I had was, how is this really any different than spreading butter on a piece of bread? Really all I've done is I've changed the consistency of it so that it's stable in a pourable form. It's kind of like gives you the ability to spread butter onto something that normally wouldn't be spreadable. And that's the Beurre Blanc. It is really amazing tasting. So that's how I cooked through 8 pounds of butter. I hope you enjoyed. If you have suggestions on other things I should do with butter or other ingredients I should try in the future, please comment below. But otherwise, thank you for watching.